All right, welcome everybody. My name is Drew Eyerly. For those of you that don't know me, I am CCL's Conservative Outreach Director. Thank you. So many of you all here, you know that my first step of my journey into working in this arena began during my time in the Army as a combat medic deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. I became concerned with the casualties. Thank you. We don't got to do all that. I was concerned with the casualties produced by our dependency on fossil fuel. And while there are many other reasons these days, national security and preserving the fighting strength of our armed service members will always be a major driving issue for me. So with that said, it is my absolute honor to introduce our amazing panelists. American Security Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank established in the early 2000s by a bipartisan group of senators, including then Senators John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, and Warren Rudman, to address the need for more robust dialogue about the changing nature of national security. American Security Project's Board of Directors and Consensus for American Security members are a coalition of former senior government officials, retired flag officers, and business leaders dedicated to exploring a broad range of security issues, including climate security and energy security. American Security Project's mission is to educate and inform, and today we are pleased to welcome to the CCL stage and so they can hopefully do just that. This will be moderated by Jessica Olcott Yelmo, ASP's Director of Climate Security Programs. And please help me in welcoming the esteemed panel. We have U.S. Marine Lieutenant General John Glad Castellaw, retired. U.S. Navy Vice Admiral Lee Gunn. And U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Norman Sipe.
Can you cue up the slides, please? I've got a few slides. Again, I'm Jessica Yelmo. I'm the Director of Climate Security Programs at ASP. Drew, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to CCL for having us today. We are thrilled to be here, preaching to the choir a little bit, but hopefully this can give you some interesting perspectives about how climate is impacting our national security. There is a ton happening in this space, and there are a lot of different elements to talk through, but today we're going to focus our conversation about how climate is impacting the U.S. military. So I've got about 10 minutes. I'm happy to share these slides at the end, and then we're going to turn it over to facilitated discussion with our esteemed panel here. Apologies to the Army. Your non-presence on the panel was unintentional. Sorry, Drew. This just happened to be the folks that we were able to get lined up today. So apologies to the Army. I will give a shout out to the Army. They're the only service branch that has an implementation plan for their climate plan. So go Army. Anyway, I will share these slides. I'm happy to do that. Come talk to me afterward, and let's get to it. So we're going to go through a couple of different things to just provide some wave tops of how we approach climate security from a think tank perspective. We'll talk about the specific plans, just wave tops again, so basic, so you can understand what's happening in this space. And then I'll touch a little bit on nuclear energy because although it's not a focus for this conference, it is a big deal in the U.S. military. America's nuclear Navy has the longest, safest track record for small modular nuclear. So yeah, it's great. Given that CCL has adopted a pro-nuclear stance, please, I'll throw up some slides, but again, come talk to me, talk to us, talk to any of our folks here, as well as visit our website. So here we go. A little bit more about ASP. We have a host of different research areas. We are relatively small, but we are focused on communicating with the American public. We also communicate with congressional leaders and key stakeholders throughout businesses, through our board of directors and our consensus. I focus on the climate side of the conversation, but we also have nuclear, like Drew said, energy. We also look at Russian diplomatic relations. So if you have any interest in these kinds of national security things that are non-traditional, please visit our website and check us out. So this is just a broad overview of how we bin our climate research at ASP. These, of course, are not exclusive to each other. This is just how we think about different elements of the conversation. So we think about how extreme weather events and weather-related disasters are impacting readiness and missions. Same thing with sea level rise and coastal degradation. All of these things play into each other, and it doesn't necessarily cause conflict directly, but we believe, and the Department of Defense believes, that this is what we call a threat multiplier. So climate makes everything much, much worse. So if you have an unstable government, it can exacerbate that. If there is a major earthquake and the government can't respond, then that makes it worse, and that may call our US military to go provide humanitarian assistance. So again, these are just some broad brush things, but you will hear us say the words threat multiplier or threat exacerbator, and that's what that means. It just means that it's an accelerant of instability, and it's really causing direct threats. So a core belief of ours is that climate security directly impacts our national security. We've believed this from the inception of the organization, and this is something that the Department of Defense and the DoD enterprise writ large has been conceptualizing since the early 2000s. Climate has been identified as a serious concern for the US military and the Department of Defense and the national security apparatus. In the quadrennial defense reviews, it's listed in our national security strategy, our national defense strategy. This is not something new. This is something that they've been working on for a really long time, and I'll let our esteemed panel talk about that a little bit more. Specifically, I'll highlight 3 ways that it impacts the military. First is on readiness, then operations, and missions. So in terms of readiness, the easiest example I can provide is extreme heat. When it is too hot outside and the wet bulb temperature is too high, you cannot train. If you cannot train, you are not prepared to go do your mission. And that impacts how ready we are to do our missions, either at home or abroad. Same thing with operations. It's changing the way and where we operate. So we've been fighting wars in the Middle East, which is hot, right? But the Arctic is melting, and that's opening up. That's a huge area of strategic competition. So now we're talking about going from an extremely hot temperature and a hot climate to operating in a very cold environment that is warming, but it's cold, right? You need a different set of uniforms. You need a different cadre of weapon systems and a different operating, just different operations in general. And then finally, obviously, the increase in natural disasters is leading already to an increase in defense support to civil authorities at home. So you see the National Guard doing everything from being substitute teachers to providing disaster relief after hurricanes to humanitarian assistance disaster relief abroad. So you're helping typhoon recoveries or other natural disasters. So this is a big deal because if your military is not doing the mission it's designed to do and it's doing these HADR missions, that's part and parcel of the job, but it also means you're not necessarily prepared to do your other missions. So as I mentioned, climate is part of almost every DoD plan at this point. It's in the National Security Strategy, it's in the National Defense Strategy. And each of the service branches also have their own specific climate plans. As I mentioned, the Army is the only one that has its own implementation plan, but each of these have different elements that are reaching toward the same goal, which is one, to lessen their energy use, because DoD, the entire enterprise, is the largest energy consumer in the federal government. It's also a notoriously large greenhouse gas emitter. Now, they're doing this not just because it's good for the environment, but they're pursuing these climate-friendly developments because it's an operational imperative. And again, I'll turn it over to the gentleman to my left shortly to talk more about that. Again, these are just wave tops, so you can see the different assessments that they've done. This has been going on for a really long time. So this is not new, and we're hoping that it's institutionalized at this point so we can make some real progress. This is also a priority for NATO. So you're seeing this on an international stage. It's being more conceptualized as a serious threat multiplier. Other countries are also concerned about not only their own energy use and their own climate and greenhouse gas emissions, but also how it's going to be impacting their operations. There's a lot, like I said, happening in this area to be excited about as well. These are some of the programs that DoD is operating to help facilitate resilience, be better environmental stewards around installations, and handle their operations in a way that's more beneficial to the climate. So I'm not going to anchor in on any of these, but please look these up, and I can talk about them offline. Also, just to touch on briefly, this is our chairwoman, Governor Christine Todd Whitman. She is former EPA administrator. She has been a long proponent of nuclear power and nuclear's role in a clean energy transition. So again, America's Nuclear Navy is one of the oldest and largest nuclear organizations in the world and has the best safety record of any industry of any kind, and that's important. These guys know what they're doing, and Admiral, I'll let you talk to that in just a minute. I'm gonna go quickly through these, and we're gonna get to the panel discussion now, because these guys each have 30 years in uniform. And you know, General Caswell, you're a farmer now in Tennessee, so if we have any Tennessee people, feel free to ping him with questions. But Admiral Gunn, I'm gonna start with you because you're closest to me. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your tenure as a uniform officer and now that you're out? How has the conversation changed, and why is this so important for the U.S. Navy?
Sure. Thanks very much for having us here. It's a great opportunity to talk to people who are like-minded but also action-oriented. So we appreciate very much what you're doing. I've got to confess that when I was on active duty, the climate was considered by me and by others to be a relatively static situation in which we could train now and believe that in the future whatever we were asked to do would be done in the same sorts of circumstances in which we had trained. That's no longer true. There are huge changes right now going on in all the realms that Jessica's been talking about, and I'm sure that you have discussed here, in ways that affect the future service of men and women in uniform. The conversation has changed dramatically about the environment that we anticipate we're going to put the military in the future, and the reasons that we're going to ask the military to go to the places we're going to ask them to go. The moms and pops of America deserve to know that when they send their young men and women to the service, that the service has prepared them, will prepare them to operate in the way that they'll be most effective in this new kind of world that we're facing. That means that we need to stress efficiency in many ways in which we haven't seriously thought about it in the past. It means that we need to design, develop, buy, build, and train with the kinds of equipment and the other pieces of gear and the information technology that will put young men and women in uniform in a position to prevail when they execute the mission. That's the kind of change excuse me, that I've seen come about in the last 15 or 20 years in the way the military thinks, the way the military trains, and the way the military talks about the kind of future in which it's going to have to function.
Thank you. General Sipe, can you talk a little bit about why this is so important for the Air Force?
Well, for the United States Air Force, we have the distinct honor of being the biggest users of fossil fuel in the Department of Defense. So we have a big responsibility of not only using that fuel, those fossil fuels wisely in saving as much as we can along the way, but also find means through alternative fuels, particularly a sustainable aviation fuel, in order to decrease our footprint. As a captain, didn't really care about climate change. I wanted to basically take every ounce of JP4 and JP5 in my fast jet and turn it into noise and thrust, and I worried about it when I got home. As a commander, being a deputy airman out at Iraq and Afghanistan, I put my own airmen on those convoys that were dragging fuel back and forth across Iraq and Afghanistan. And I put my own airmen, Marine, Navy, U.S. Air Force airmen, in airplanes that were overflying those convoys to ensure that they could get from point A to point B. And 3,000 of them didn't get there, whether it be because of injuries or fatalities there. So that was a pretty big awakening call for myself as a commander as far as the climate impacts that had on our day-to-day operations. And it became part of a daily routine as far as what was on that flying schedule there. I think our airmen are We probably don't give them enough credit for thinking about climate. Obviously, it's not the first thing you talk about when you get to the water cooler in the morning, but it certainly becomes part of the conversation as we look at the intensity, the severity, the duration of the climate events that are impacting us. And as a good American, we're going to go to the sound of the bugle there, whether it be in support of DISCA or support of our own selves as far as HADRs to ensure that our citizens are taken care of as these climate events happen. So when I look at our 2022 national security, it recognizes climate change as an existential challenge. I would submit to you, it's no longer a challenge, it's an existential threat. It's a direct threat. And so in the military, when you talk about direct threats, that changes your whole way of how you think, how you plan, how you execute, how you do logistics through the whole gamut there. So we're seeing across the Joint Force there, war games that talk about climate impacts on the scenario there. We're talking about our Bible for planning, which is Joint Pub 5, that now talks about climate change, bringing that into our discussions there. And no longer do we treat climate as just a constraint that we try to work around. In some cases, we have to deal with it directly as we're doing our other missions there. So we've come a long way. Do we have a long way to go? Yeah. Department of Defense if it was a country, it would be the 55th contributor to climate gas emissions in the world there. So we have a responsibility not only to our taxpayers, but to our men and women that are going to carry out that mission to lower that footprint and do our share of kind of turning this trend that we're on, which is in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you. General Costello?
You know, we're talking about how it used to be. When I was a young captain flying around in a helicopter, the only time I ever thought I had too much gas was when I was on fire and trying to dump it. But we have changed our views. Jim Mattis is the same generation as I am, and he famously said, you know, cut the tether to fuel the fossil fuel that I have to deal with. And we're trying very hard to do that. Some of the ways that we're doing that may not seem to be a big deal, but it adds up. For instance, you know, whether you're a Marine Lance Corporal or a Army private, you learn to drive 5-ton trucks at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And when you learn to drive that truck, you learn to drive it tactically so you can survive and do your mission, but also where you use the least amount of fuel. The jets that my friend to the right used to fly and everything, and the new ones that are replacing them, as they are evaluated as how they're going to be put into service, one of the areas that they look hard at is how much gas is it's going to use. They're trying to make sure that whoever replaced General Sipe doesn't use as much gas as he did. Installations. One of the big expenses when you run a base is electricity and all the fuel and energy that you use. It just makes sense to cut the amount that you do, that you use. And so solar panels and other renewables are being widely implemented in our bases. And there's a real reason to do this, and it's called instability. I was stationed at the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, Germany, and it was before Africa came into existence, and one of the things that in my portfolio was Africa. And I remember saying, Costello, you got to go down to Chad. Said, we've got instability down there, something's going on, so we may have to do a non-combatant evacuation, so go down there and look. And I went down there, and what I saw was because of changing climate, the Lake Chad was going down in level. It forced fishermen off, about 200,000 off of the lake. Herdsmen to the north, the Sahara is coming a mile a year south, pushed them on into the farmers on the south side of the lake. And so that became very much of an interest to us because we would have to employ Americans, men and women, to deal with that instability, potentially to withdraw, rescue Americans that were in that area that were put at hazard. So the military is very much concerned about the impacts of climate, how we're using energy, and the domino effect that all of that generates.
Thank you. One of the things to sort of dovetail on that, sort of two sides of the same coin, we want to reduce, we being the United States in the military, want to reduce our fuel usage abroad or when we're on operations because it does save lives. So many lives are lost in fuel convoys, just protecting the fuel lines, that it makes sense both from a life preservation perspective as well as a security perspective to pivot to a different kind of vehicle or move away from fossil fuels. So Admiral Gunn, I'm going to pitch this question to you. In each of the climate plans for each of the service branches, there is a prioritization for adopting electric vehicles. And there are a couple different reasons for that, which I'll let you go into. But that also ties into the policy agenda here at CCL because the permitting reform also impacts the military's ability to transition to these electric vehicles because they need to be able to plug into the grids. These installations are not monoliths. They're not islands. They have to plug into the community around them. So that permitting reform, that slow permitting reform, is holding back the DoD from being able to move forward on these things. That's important because the Department of Defense has the second largest vehicle fleet in the federal government. So can you talk a little bit more about why that is so important and what kind of progress we should be looking for?
Absolutely. General Castellaw mentioned the base efficiency measures. Those are really important. Jessica mentioned the fact that our military installations are not islands. You can have the best possible plan and you can execute it really well inside the fence line to maintain your electrical supply in the event that there's a disruption outside. But if you haven't worked with your surrounding community in advance to try to create the infrastructure and to make sure that it's sustainable in a way that will allow the sailors and Marines and soldiers and airmen who live off the base to get to the base to execute the mission, that is a serious failing. And so now that we understand that bases are not islands, that in addition to supporting their own internal requirements for mission accomplishment, that they need to be in a position to assist the surrounding community in maintaining the functions that are necessary there. We have to share in both efficiencies and in creative ways to manage the energy that will allow us both, civilian and military, to do our job. In the United States, the rural electrification business is extraordinarily important, in my view, from a national security perspective. The military, each of our services, is dedicating a part of its acquisition program to acquiring non-tactical vehicles that are electrically propelled. And in the process, I think, the military will make a market, not because it wants to make a market to do this, but because it makes sense to use electrical vehicles on military installations, but will participate in the making of a market that will allow electric vehicles to spread more widely, more quickly in the United States. And it's important that the charging infrastructure follow that. And the charging infrastructure issue gets us back to what Jessica was talking about, what I know many of you are talking about with regard to permitting reform. That is a top-of-the-mind kind of issue in order to allow that to happen.
General Castellaw, General Sipes, do you have anything to add that you want to add on that?
You know, average infantry battalion in the Marine Corps has increased the amount of electrical items, equipment, about 400%. 400%. We see all through the services increase in the requirement for additional electricity generation and acquisition. So what we're doing also, in addition to figuring out how we can, take backpack solar panels and portable wind turbines, is, how can we do a better job of using what we have and figuring out how to do that, use the equipment that we have in a more efficient and better way. And how about hydrogen and some of the other sources that we're using? All this, is being looked at, and how it can be incorporated into our units to do what Mattis has asked for, to cut that tether to fossil fuel.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that one of the key words that all the services use is resiliency. And so we're looking at how we can be a resilient base, how we can be a resilient weapon system, so to speak. We don't want to be a one-trick pony. Our Secretary of the Air Force has said we'll take in any and all comers when it comes to different types of fuels. We'll even take carbon capture if in fact it turns out that it's viable. But we need to have the microgrids, we need to have alternative fuel sources in order to, one, fight forward at bases that are very austere, that are going to be there for a month or a week and then disappear as we move forward, because we're going to be facing an enemy out there potentially that's going to contest all our logistics. And if all our logistics are tied to fossil fuels, guess what? I'll find a solution, because I've got one thing to look at, and that's fossil fuel vice, giving the enemy multiple dilemmas as far as how to stop the United States military from moving forward, defending itself, and then, God forbid, in a situation where we have to go to war, ensure that our young men, sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, and guardians are equipped to do the job.
Let me bring it back momentarily to nuclear power. I know that that's something that is of interest to many of you. It's a case where permitting is probably the very most difficult obstacle to getting things done. Worldwide, there's a great deal of research being done on small modular nuclear reactors. There is research being done here too, but the anticipation for deployment of small modular nuclear reactors in the United States is not nearly what it is elsewhere in the country. And I just wanted to re-emphasize something that you heard earlier. The Navy has been operating nuclear power in some of the most unforgiving environments on the planet since 1954. USS Nautilus underway on nuclear power, the first time a ship ever went to sea on nuclear power, and we have operated literally hundreds of small modular nuclear reactors in this unforgiving environment under the most demanding circumstances with I considered perfect safety over the years. And so we ought to trust ourselves. We ought to refine the permitting requirements in a way that will match the ingenuity that's being exercised in the development of nuclear power in the small modular way, so that it can be deployed that way too.
I'll just add one thing on that. I'm from West Virginia, so I'm a former coal community person, and there's actually some incredibly interesting developments that are happening now on how to retrofit retired coal power plants to nuclear facilities. So that, I think the first project is still a little ways away from being complete, but that could be a really interesting development, and we've got some stuff, again, on our website about that. I want to pivot a little bit quickly to Florida. Anybody from Florida in here? No? Okay. So you may have noticed on my second slide, we had a picture of Florida up there. We actually have a dedicated line of programming focused on Florida. Why? Florida is home to over 20 military bases and installations. And you may already know, obviously, the climate impacts that are in Florida that are very obvious. 2018, sort of one of the poster children for climate impacts is Tyndall Air Force Base, which was essentially leveled by Hurricane Michael. Last year, Mayport dodged a bullet. But General Slight, maybe you can talk a little bit about why it's so important for these installations that are on the coast, typically, just by the nature of what they're doing, right? If you're in the Navy, you're on the coast, right? So you're gonna be dealing with sea level rise. In Florida, there's an incredible training ground for Air Force pilots. So what happens there and what happens at your state level really does impact national security, and that's true across the board. So General Slipe, can you talk a little bit about why the mitigation and adaptation and resilience is so important at these installations?
Yeah, you pretty much answered the question, but everything that's been said has been said, but not by me. So I would submit to you that, just as you said, where do we train with the Navy? We train over the water. Where do we want to have our bases? Near the water. Where can we take the F-35 and do 300-mile setups that we require, vice the days where we did 10-mile setups? Over the Gulf of Mexico, over the Atlantic Ocean there. So we need the ranges, we need the space and distance to do that, and we don't want to spend the gas of being 200 miles inland in order to get to those areas there. So there's a cost, and I've answered many a person that said, you know, you flattened Tyndall Air Force Base when Hurricane Michael came through. Why are you putting your money back into it? Well, hopefully we're going to build smarter, better with the type of things, and it's going to be kind of our poster child for future installations. As a reminder, we have built very few new installations across any of the services. The last one we built prior to redoing Tyndall was Schriever Air Force Base, and that was over 35 years ago. So we've got infrastructure out there that's going to have to contend with the climate change that's going on out there. The GAO reports that there's over 100 military installations that are going to be impacted by rising sea levels or by the fact that the ground is going in a different direction there. So we just can't ignore the fact there. So this whole idea about resiliency, bringing in private partnerships in order to share the costs there, just makes good sense as far as our maintaining our combat credibility and capability. I'll throw in the Guardian's pitch. Where do we launch missiles, rockets from? We launch them from places that aren't going to cover half the United States. God forbid something happens to that rocket being launched there. They're on the coast there. So we've got a vested interest to ensure that our military readiness can be supported by the environment and by the climate events that are going around it.
Let me say one thing. I almost got a divorce in Florida. I was stationed at MacDill, which is in the middle of Tampa Bay. I was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Central Command. And Tampa's been lucky. I hadn't had direct strikes. I live right on the shore, and the water, of course, is rising. So it's also impacting all the installations that we've got there. He talked about Tyndall, but there's MacDill, there's Jacksonville, Mayport, Blunt Island, Marine Logistic Location, and so forth. So this is a real threat to our ability to project forces, organize, support, and project forces.
Yeah, 79 installations. There was a 2019 DoD climate impact report, and there were 79 installations that were classified as at extreme risk for severe climate impacts. And that's important. So when you're talking to either your senators or your congressmen in a state that maybe isn't as welcoming to climate information on the environmental side, pull this in. We've got tons of resources. We are an educate and inform organization. We're not an advocacy organization, but this is important to know. And sometimes the senators and congressmen don't understand the links between these things. 8 of those most at-risk bases are in Florida. That's a big deal because the governor in Florida is not exactly a strong climate advocate. But helping him understand, helping at the state level and helping these people understand these links is really, really important. And I'm going to ask one question, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. If you have a question, just put it up in the air, and I believe one of the CCL folks will come grab it for you. So we've talked a lot, actually, about doom and gloom. What do you think are the most beneficial opportunities coming down the road from DoD and each of the services acting on climate?
I'll volunteer that it's learning and provide an example of how to do things differently. The Navy's built a hybrid ship. all of our ships that aren't nuclear powered are powered, of course, with fossil fuel. But the gas turbines that power most of our ships are very efficient at medium and high speed, very inefficient at low speed. We actually built a large amphibious ship, USS Macon Island, that is powered by electricity at low speeds. And so at high speeds, they use the fossil fuels to charge the batteries, and then at low speeds, where the ships often are lingering off of the coast at 5 knots or so, they run on electricity. It's doing things differently, I think, that makes a huge difference. It's going back to that point that the military is going to add to their fleets hundreds, thousands of vehicles a year to the non-tactical fleet that will be electrically powered. But Undersecretary of Defense Hicks said that for those of us who are not ground combat types, it was kind of surprising. She said there are advantages to the operation of 70-ton main battle tanks in partially electrifying them so that they can proceed with the conventional power that they have now to the combat area, but then shift to electricity from charged banks that will allow them to be quieter, so that all of you hear is the tank treads and you don't hear the gas turbines. I'm not qualified to talk about the Army gear, but I was impressed by that, and I think it brings home the idea that learning in the military to do things differently should benefit the entire society as well.
You know, you go back to when the internet was invented and when microchips came on board, and although DoD can't take sole claim for both of those, they certainly were very much involved. We're at an inflection point where the military can take the lead and help push forward some of these new technologies out there, whether it be sustainable aviation fuel that powers both our commercial fleets out there and our own military fleets out there, whether it be this, what do we call it, a blended wing type of technology for new airplanes, which then can carry more passengers, but do it at a lower cost, burn less fuel, do it with sustainable aviation fuel. So there's an opportunity for the military to take the lead, despite all the other things that are tugging at it. But we have the opportunity to take the lead, put it into the system, and then let good old capitalism pick the winners and losers out there. But we need to move forward. We need to do our job, and I think the American public would welcome what we bring to the table in the way of innovation, working with commercial, working with our partners out there. Thanks.
Talking about the internet, I just want to remind everybody that Albert Gore is a fellow Tennessean. Marine Corps is sort of controversial nowadays. A lot of change going on, innovations. And just like we see where we talk about countering climate change, trying to do things smarter with our logistics and so forth, anytime you change, you run into those that are going to push back against it. And so what we need now is people that understand what the challenge is and what the solutions are and how we can come together as in organizations like this to apply pressure where it counts with our legislators and so forth. Because we are in a situation where our national security is at risk unless we figure out how to be more effective in reducing our use of fossil fuels, to be more effective in how we establish our footprints that we use to defend this great nation of ours. We need to do it.
I can't really see in the back. Do we have any questions?
We do have quite a number.
Great.
Someone asks, can you talk about resilience plans for coastal Navy facilities?
I'm sorry.
The resilience plans for
Coastal.
coastal naval facilities.
I'll start on that. Jacksonville, Florida. I went down there to visit those folks, and I think Lee talked a little bit about Mayport. You know, the situation with Mayport is the surrounding areas, the egress routes, otherwise known as roads, are prone to go underwater during times of high tide, aggravated by winds and so forth. The river there as well. So the city of Jacksonville, understanding about the value that Mayport is economically as well as national security, is working with the Navy there in Jacksonville to put plans in place of how to, first of all, mitigate and figure out how to make it more accessible during those times. But the overall solution, of course, is to reduce the impact that climate change is having on the intensity. I'm a farmer from Tennessee. You know, I graduated from University of Tennessee with a degree in agriculture and a brand new wife, and I said, honey, 3 years and we're back on the farm, and we stayed in for 36. I came back to the farm there in Crockett County, Tennessee, and one of the things that was immediately evident to me is the intensity increase in the thunderstorms and the weather events that we're seeing. The washes, we're implementing tremendous conservation efforts in American agriculture, but it is taken more and more because of the intensity that we're running into. More frequency and more intense when it happens. And that's what we're having to deal with in places like Mayport.
A couple of other examples. Norfolk Naval Station is the largest naval facility in the world and is subject to both sea level rise and ground level subsidence. And it is the case that there are probably 15 or 20 days a year when traffic comes to a halt completely on the naval station, and that's just sunny day flooding. It's just the actions that repeat themselves regularly absent any storms. The carrier piers were elevated there, and the way they elevated them was actually to build a second set of piers on top of the solid foundations of the first set to elevate the utilities, to serve the ship, and to provide access to and from the ship as well. I say that for two reasons. One is to indicate that things are going on, but also how difficult it is going to be. I did an interview on New Hampshire radio. Many of the people in southeastern New Hampshire work at the Naval Shipyard, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And the question was on this NPR show, how difficult is it going to be to make the shipyard resilient against rising seas? And the answer is damn difficult. I mean, imagine you've got shipyard facilities, shops and piers, but also dry docks with the kind of access and egress that we've always depended on, going back to that earlier comment, gee, the world tomorrow is going to be just like the world yesterday. It isn't. And as we try to modernize the Navy's facilities for maintenance and for construction throughout the country, we have to take into account these new confounding variables that make it all that more difficult and expensive, and draw the resources away from other things we would like to, on behalf of the American people, invest in for achieving missions in the future.
I'll just add a couple of things. First is specific to the Navy. Obviously, San Diego and Norfolk Hampton Roads are the two main concentrations of the Navy. So tomorrow evening, when Congressman Peters comes to talk, ask him about what they're doing there. They're doing a lot of port work there. So ask him what's going on in San Diego. Also, it was on a slide very briefly, but the Hampton Roads area just released its military installation resilience review. So if you are interested, you can Google it, or you can just shoot me an email, and I'll send you that review. And it talks about all the different things that they're doing to enhance resilience in all of those bases in that Hampton Roads area.
Yeah, in fact, to pile on that, Jessica, and I only speak for the Air Force, but I'm assuming it's going on in the other services, is that the Air Force has been directed by our secretary to do an assessment at every base out there based on climate risk and climate events, and then to take those risks and fold it into their master plan for the base, as well as fold it into their electrification power plans. So it's being done in a very deliberate process there, but as I read in one article, if you get it wrong, guess what? You've already paid for that concrete that you just laid down there. And if it's in the wrong place or it wasn't high enough, and that's the cost, again, that we as taxpayers are paying for, and that's money that's probably being diverted away from readiness that we could use for our training out there.
Thanks.
We have another question here. Does American Security Project do in-district events in military communities? How could a CCL chapter go about setting that up?
I am so glad you asked that question. Whoever
That
asked
was-
that question, was that one of
it
our
was-
interns
it was
that
a
are here
plan.
that asked that question?
It was
So
a plan.
yes, we do. Two things. First and foremost, we do offer internships, spring, fall, and summer. And our fall internship is opening, I believe, July 1st. Matthew, if you're here, get on it. But those are open. So we have openings in each of our subject matter areas, general national security areas. But to answer that specific question, yes, we do. We operate and conduct our flagship program, which is the National Climate Security Tour. We have done events just like this in more than 21 states. I think we're up to like 50-some events at this point. We partner with universities, VFWs. We can partner with CCL. And what we do is I take the show on the road. So we just did one, Andrew, if you're here, we just did one in Pittsburgh, which was fantastic and one of my favorite events, sorry. We just did one in Pensacola, and we've done them in, like I said, 21 states. So if you are interested, I will throw up the last slide as we come to the end here. And that has our general contact, thank you, our general contact info, or I will give you my card. Come find me afterward. But yes, absolutely, we can partner on this stuff, and we can talk, we can tailor the events to whatever seems to be the biggest concern in that area. So for example, we are in the early stages of planning a National Climate Security Tour event in Arizona. So we will be talking a lot about water. So we are happy to partner with anybody, so just reach out.
Great, thank you. How much influence does the military have over members of Congress to stress the threat multiplier effect of climate change to get Congress to take more action?
Say that. Anybody?
We're not afraid to go up to the Hill and talk the importance of climate change and the impact it has on the military. I know. I'm not telling you we're any more successful than any of you out there, but the idea is to inform and educate and hopefully have a conversation where instead of increasing the volume of your words, you're increasing the value of your words. And slowly but surely, we're chipping away at it. And I'll be honest with you, I'm involved with a couple other nonprofits that do the inform and educate. And quite honestly, right now, we have more success at the state level because you can bring a local sheriff, in this case, you can bring a local airman in, or a local soldier, and talk about what's going on at his base, and he can make the case. Now, wouldn't it make sense to do this or that and get kind of the upward type of forcing function that you get from a state capitol and a legislative body that you might not get going right to the Hill and going down? So it's not a spectator sport, it's a contact sport. Everyone has to play in it, and you have to make your case.
And I think the important part is just framing it in a way that, which is something that the gentleman talked about this morning, is framing it in a way that is receivable for whoever it is that you're meeting with. So find out their interests and their equities and speak to that. So I'm from West Virginia. I am not going to be talking to Senator Manch's staff about sea level rise in Norfolk, right? Like, I'm going to be talking about the real world operational impacts to the fact that the West Virginia National Guard is going on missions overseas because there are more natural disasters, and that's increasing their op tempo, so they're not available as resources to do other things domestically. So if you've got a state and you're wanting to some help with how to connect those dots, absolutely reach out. I don't know that I can help you tonight in advance of tomorrow, unless you're Florida, but making the conversation really palatable for whoever it is that you're talking to. So, for example, Congressman Gallagher is the chair of the China Committee, so we do a lot of connecting the dots with climate, China, and national security. So we do that educate and inform, and we're not advocating for a specific way or a specific bill, but we're saying, hey, this is a real world issue. This is actually really impacting our military's ability to operate.
It's important that the members of the relevant committees, the National Security, National Defense committees, are well informed. I think they very much, today at least, they understand the difficulties the military is facing and the challenges that it presents to the budget, but to operations and to mission characterization and all of those things. Keeping them informed is really important. They're also the folks who carry, I think, more clout probably in a national security way throughout the House and the Senate than the average member does. And so being frank with them is very important, and giving them the detail, equipping them with the stories that allow them to go forth and talk about how important these issues are is really important. And so I had another point to make, and I forgot it. But it
It'll
was
come
really
back.
important.
Do we have any more?
The most important and the most powerful person in working with the legislatures is the one that's in that district. They're going to listen to you before they'll listen to us if we're out of town. So make sure you connect with a district director. It'll be some guy or gal that represents the congressman in that district. Get to know them and go through them to make your desires known and your groups doing that. That's the best way to get it done.
Thank you. And congratulations on the Navy's nuclear safety record. Someone asks, what happens to the Navy's spent nuclear fuel?
The Secretary of Energy the other day, and of course the Energy Department is responsible for the storage, the safe storage of somewhat depleted nuclear fuel. And I say that in that way because it makes the point that there's a great deal of energy remaining in what we consider spent fuel rods. She said that the most carefully observed, governed, safeguarded waste of any kind on the planet is the spent nuclear fuel from U.S. military and power plants that we keep here on our own territory in the United States. There are technologies that I believe will be applied in the future to extract the remaining, much of the remaining energy from those nuclear fuel rods. We're not there yet, and we don't have the treaty allowances to permit us to do that. And nuclear waste is a problem and will continue to be a problem, but it is not, I think, as extensive a problem by any means as the problems we've created with generating our electricity, generating our heat from fossil fuels. I mean, the size of one slag pond in Virginia is such, from a coal-fired plant, is such that all of the U.S. spent nuclear fuel could be contained in that one pond. And that's just one slag pond, fouling local water, streams, and the like. And so, anyway, I can get on a high horse about nuclear power. There is a cost with generating electricity right now from any means we have available to us. And actually, one of the smallest costs is that associated with nuclear power.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Somebody asks, my congressman has mentioned his concern about national security and the threat of going green too quickly related to the need for critical minerals from Chinese-controlled suppliers. Any advice about what we might say to this member of Congress?
I'll make one comment. Anything that's new, there's probably a 100% chance that we won't get it 100% right as we go down that course. That doesn't mean that we'd be willy-nilly with safety and how we approach that problem set. But if we're waiting for the perfect solution or 100% assurance that things will work out, you're doomed for failure. You're doomed to get behind the power curve, so to speak. And guess what? You'll reach a point in time where you can't square the corner. You're going to live what you get every day with the climate that you have. So again, waiting for that perfect solution there, to me, is an easy way of pushing the conversation off. Let's talk the conversation and let's go in with the idea of yes if, instead of starting the conversation with no because. No because gets you nowhere. Yes if allows you to have that conversation and work through the courses of action, look at the risk, how to mitigate the risk, how to go forward and get as close to that 100% solution that you're looking for.
Let me make yeah, about rare earths. Lithium is in the news a lot, and rightly so. 92% of the lithium that is mined on the planet right now is in China, Australia, and Chile. But there is lithium almost everywhere. In the United States, a lithium mine is going to be reopened in California that was closed years ago. There's the potential for another one in northeastern Nevada. The Salton Sea, the brine in the Salton Sea has lithium in it, and there's a plant right now operating at scale removing lithium from the Salton Sea. And it turns out that the brine is produced by fracking that yields oil and natural gas in the brine that is used to produce oil and natural gas. And those elements are sufficiently dense that they have the potential for economically being viable in the future as places from which to extract lithium. I just want to convey I have this boundless enthusiasm and optimism with regard to the technological possibilities that are ahead of us. This is going to be a lot better world in a lot more places if we handle this properly. And I think encouraging the members of Congress to think about that in that way, and particularly in light of the Inflation Reduction Act and other things that have been done legislatively in this last year, the optimism to put that to work, I think, is needed, and the momentum is there, and the Congress needs to help us capitalize on that.
I'll just add one final thing on that to practice a little bit from this morning. I would say to your congressperson or senator, your concerns are warranted due to China's dominance of the critical mineral supply chain. But I'm so glad you brought this up. And then I would start to point to the litany of things that the Biden administration has done over the past 2 years, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Sciences Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the critical mineral regulations. And the long and short of it is, without going into too much detail, is that this is a huge opportunity, as my colleagues mentioned here, that will create jobs in the U.S. So it's already doing that, and I'm happy to provide those resources, but I don't want to take too much time on it now. But if you need that ammunition, no pun intended, just reach out to me.
All right, so as we come to a close here, what I'm going to ask, I know you all are going to have questions and want to talk to these fine people. Please let them get off the stage first, okay, before you run up here. And before we even get to that point, let's go ahead and give a round of applause for these great people doing great work for this great country.